and welcome to the InfoQ podcast, a software engineering podcast brought to you by the same team behind InfoQ.com. InfoQ.com is a software engineering news site which aims to help progressive software development teams adopt new technology. We are also the people behind the International Software Conference, QCon. My name is Wesley Reisz. I'm the conference chair for QCon. Today I'm here with Adrian Cockcroft, who will be speaking at the upcoming QCon New York, which is on June 13th through the 15th. Adrian's QCon New York talk is entitled Microservices, a State of the Union. Adrian is a fellow at Battery Ventures. Prior to joining Battery, he led Netflix migration to a large-scale, highly available public cloud architecture and the open sourcing of the cloud-native Netflix OSS platform. So I think it's safe to say, Adrian, that you're probably best known for your work at Netflix. Is that pretty fair?
Yeah, that's right.
So what kind of things are you doing at Battery Ventures today?
Well, I've been at Battery a little over 2 years now, and I'm part of a team that based in the Bay Area, that looks at enterprise IT investments. And I do several things there. One is I try to build an interesting network of people to talk to about this stuff. So there's C-level executives down to developers. Spend a lot of time at conferences, particularly because that's where I keep up to date and find interesting people, new ideas, and help connect people. And then I do due diligence on investments that we're looking at. And once we've made an investment, or if we think somebody's particularly interesting, I spend time helping them out with scalability, advice on architecture generally, those kinds of things.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I saw, I guess about a year ago, you did a talk, a very similar talk on kind of microservices, a State of the Union. So this is a year later now. So what's the state of the union with microservices today?
Yeah, so I did a talk at DockerCon Europe sometime around a year ago, and what I did there was try to set out all the different ways people were approaching microservices at the time. So I kind of said, well, this is sort of the Netflix flavor approach. This is the Twitter flavor. And one of the things was it seemed to depend on what your base language was, where you ended up.
Sure.
So if you were a bunch of Java developers, then you pretty much go, well, there's this Spring Cloud thing that looks pretty helpful. So then you naturally end up in a fairly Netflixy oriented environment because Spring Cloud plugs into the Netflix open source tooling, and Netflix is a largely Java shop. So that's one space. And then if you're into Scala, there was Twitter and Gilt that have done a lot of work in Scala and have open source tooling around that. It's a different flavor. There's just some different base packages you'd use for communication and tracking things. And then Go and Node and various other, those are the main other languages I think that I picked up on. There's a few Go-based frameworks and some Node-based frameworks. So most of these things were emerging a year ago. I tried to create a little taxonomy that said, I have a bunch of buckets that you need to pick something. You need to pick a way to do communications, and you need to pick a discovery mechanism, and how are you going to, do you have a container model, and all those kinds of things. And I said, these are, at the time, the current state of the art was sort of early playing around with some of the Docker-related services and tooling. So a year later, we've gone from a situation where really a few years ago, you had to invent this stuff yourself. Then a year ago, there were a bunch of nascent projects and brand new things you could play with. And the situation now is there's too much to choose from. And everyone's in sort of analysis paralysis because they can't decide which container scheduler they want to play with because there's a new one every week or a new one. Actually, I just noticed that I think Rancher is now like 1.0 or something. I don't know what their versioning is, but and a few weeks ago, Nomad became 1.0. And there's all these things moving very rapidly right now. So you've got the Docker tooling set itself, Swarm and Compose and all of those things. Got Kubernetes and there's sort of another environment building around that. Mesos, who just announced a big funding round and seemed to be doing quite well.
Yeah.
And then HashiCorp always come out with something interesting and easy to use, and so Nomad sort of suddenly turned up, and and Rancher, and probably a few others that I've forgotten. So yeah, you spend all your time looking at GitHub and trying to count number of stars on a project. Basically, it's the new world for developer things. So that's what I think is interesting. I'll be trying to figure out sort of a snapshot of where they are and the trajectory that each of these tool sets is on, and how to think about choosing between them. What if you're coming from here, then this one makes sense. If you're coming from here, this one makes sense. So if you're focused largely on premise, you'll probably come up with something different than if you're on public cloud, and if you're on small scale, there's different optimizations from really large scale and things like that.
So it sounds like it's fairly safe to say it's kind of language agnostic. It's, if you're at this particular point in an enterprise or this particular point in your life cycle of developing software, this might be an approach you want to go. If you're this kind of stack, you might want to go Node or Java or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Netflix is largely Java, quite a lot of Python with Node as its front end. So they've got a somewhat agnostic stack, although a lot of the tooling they've released is quite Java-centric. And you tend to find that because microservices let you mix things in.
Right.
But the more you get off center from which, you have to kind of pick a center of gravity, basically, to build all your tooling around. And then anything that doesn't fit that particular language, you use this technique that people tend to call sidecars. So, if you need to run a memcached service, well, memcached has no idea that it's running in a microservice environment. So you run an extra little thing on the side that knows how to talk to the rest of your architecture, basically, and does monitoring and locates everything, and does all of the hooking up of all of logging and discovery and all those kinds of health tracking.
Right. So as you're putting together this kind of State of the Union, I almost said speech, this talk on microservices, what is the persona that you kind of have envisioned for the talk of people that will attend?
I tend to get a lot of sort of enterprise architecture type people, some developers, a few managers. So that's what I typically do, is try to explain for the managers how to think about organizing the work and the building teams and how to lay things out. Right. One of the key things in microservices is this idea around Conway's law, which basically says that the organization of a company will basically guide the way it builds its software. So the management thing is, if you're trying to do microservices in an environment that's got a very hierarchical stovepipe company organization, you're just going to fail because you're fighting the organization to get things done. So there is a management lesson here and even if you're a developer, you need to understand the way management should look if you're building microservices. So I usually start with that. And the motivations is why we're doing this, to speed things up, get everything done. It's about speeding up development and getting more competitive. And then talk a bit about the different architectures themselves, what's the difference between them, how I define interesting sort of bits and pieces of microservices. And then the things that people leave out or get wrong or find difficult. So that's sort of where I get a bit more into the weeds with some technical detail. Things like, this is something I sort of figured out recently. Just when you've got lots of services, well, when you call it, you don't know if it's going to answer, so you put a timeout on it, right? And so simple things like, well, what should the timeout be? And people, I have no idea, right? So they just set all the timeouts to some large number of seconds, and then, well, I don't really want it to fail, so I'm just going to keep retrying and hope that it gets better. Yeah. So there's a massive sort of anti-pattern around that. If you give everyone the same timeout and lots of retries, the system actually suffers from a kind of a congestion collapse problem. A single failure can actually tip the entire system over, which is, you've just taken your fragile monolith and turned it into a bunch of fragile microservices, and then you'll probably complain that microservices don't work, and actually all you did was get your timeout strategy wrong. Right. The trick there is to have a really large timeout at the edge and progressively smaller and smaller timeouts as you get deeper into the system. Nice, so that you get to timeout and respond deep in the system before the edge services have actually timed out. So you get a fast fail, and you don't waste time doing work that no one's going to look at, basically.
So this timeout example that you just gave, I kind of see that as a tangible, actionable benefit I'd get from
Yeah,
coming to your talk.
yeah,
Um, is that a good portion of the talk? Will there be a significant amount of things after you do kind of the State of the Union? Is there
yeah,
going to be a lot of actionable benefits in the talk that I can take away and kind of take back to my shop?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that particular thing, if you, it really, you just by changing the timeout values in your architecture, you can make it much more stable. It's much more able to recover from the kind of little kicks and small failures that tend to blow up into big ones. So um, I've got a few things like that I'm talking about, how to make systems more robust, basically. Spent some time looking at how to choose monitoring tools for microservices because it's still relatively new. A lot of monitoring tools weren't really designed to deal with lots and lots of different microservices chatting back and forth.
Right.
So if you've got a system that's designed around a very simple three-tier architecture kind of model where stuff stays the same for a long time, that kind of monitoring doesn't work well. You want something that's looking at a fine grain, maybe 1 second to 10-second resolution updates, and it can deal with the dependencies across lots of systems. So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about.
Great. So tell me something. Is a microservices architecture always the right approach for all companies, or is there a time when it's the wrong approach?
It's usually wrong to start with if you're just building something simple and you're a startup. I mean, there's a lot. You can build a Ruby on Rails system in an afternoon, and it'll be functional and it'll be reliable, and you won't have many features in an afternoon, but it'll be up and running. Right? If you start designing a microservices architecture first, you'll be weeks in before you get the first thing up, because you've got too many choices to make. So people typically start with something more like a Ruby on Rails or whatever, some variant like that, some packaged front end with a single back end. And then at some point you outgrow that, and you've got too many developers and they keep breaking each other's code, and the system starts falling over because you changed in one piece of the system that broke everything else. So there's a point at which the team gets big enough, and typically, it's not worth splitting things up until you have more than a handful of people. So your code should be sort of in one monolithic place to start with, because it just doesn't make sense to spread it out. But if you want, MySQL and Redis and Nginx and all of those things, you don't go and hand compile those and build them into one image. You basically go to, you generate a Docker Compose file and pull them from Docker Hub or something. So people generally have an architecture that is built out of a bunch of off-the-shelf microservices like Redis. And then they have their code in one blob in the middle, talking to one database with one schema. And the problem is that as it grows, there's a point at which you have to say, I need a second database, I need a third database. I shouldn't be mixing unrelated concerns in the same database. And I need to split off some of the code that I'm building into a separate system. And now you get into, well, how do you find these other systems and how do you distribute them? And typically when you get into scaling the team and needing to be more highly available, that's where you need to get into microservices, because you're building a distributed system at that point. And you've got, once you get to about 100 people, a monolith is pretty hard to run. It can be done, but it's a very, very difficult thing for most organizations to efficiently build something that's got hundreds of changes going into each release. It's just too hard to work out what broke what. Right?
So have we seen critical mass with microservices, or what are you seeing that's coming up? We're at critical mass?
Well, it's not really critical mass. There was a couple of microservice conferences at the beginning of last year. There's one called Micro Exchange in Berlin, which started off as a meetup, and it sort of exploded into a 300-person conference that everybody who was everybody in microservices went to. That was the initial sort of coming together. We did that again this last February. Again, a relatively small conference with a very high proportion of the people that wrote the books on microservices and the people that are going around talking about it. We just got together to kind of swap ideas and see where we'd got to. And I think what you saw last year was it was a software architecture conference kind of discussion and a developer topic. And then what you're seeing this year is it's moved up to the management chain. So there's usually a management buzzword of the year, right?
Absolutely.
Those like, have you done big data yet? Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Have you done cloud yet?
Spark now.
Have you done containers yet? So last year was probably containers, right? And there were a number of these buzzwords, right? But one of the standard ones last year was, okay, have you got a Docker strategy? Have you figured out how to do containers? And then if you actually start doing Docker, it's just all about microservices. All the discussion is there. So what you're seeing this year is people at management level talking about breaking up the monolith to go faster, and you're hearing microservices just thrown around by C-level execs as a thing. Right? Maybe so like the CEO is asking the CIO if they're doing it yet or something. It's a bit of a caricature, but I'm seeing discussions by people who aren't in the software architecture space where they're using the word and there is a reasonably broad understanding of what it means now.
Right.
Although it's still a bit nascent in terms of tooling in some respects, it's getting more mature in terms of just general production use and people understanding it. So it's sort of arrived. The other one that's coming up right now is serverless computing, which is you take microservices down to individual events and you fire up a service just to run that one event and then shut it down again. So event driven. And that works pretty well for the back end sort of event flow business logic side of a lot of systems. So there's that's sort of the new hot topic, if you like, in the architecture world is around serverless, and AWS Lambda is now being used in production. Google, Microsoft, and IBM have all released pretty much direct sort of clone / competitors to it for cloud use and on-prem use. And there's a few startups and frameworks, but it's still pretty early. I don't think there's any of the major monitoring tools that currently have any clue how to monitor serverless systems, for example.
So you keep stealing my next questions. You've listened to too many of these podcasts. You know the next question coming up. I was going to ask you what the future is. You hit serverless architecture perfectly.
There's a few other interesting things kicking around. Actually, the other thing is to go in the exact opposite direction from microservices, which I call Terraservices.
Terraservices?
Terra,
okay.
Terabyte-sized services.
Right.
Instead of being 100 lines of code running in 100 megabytes of memory or whatever, I want to run things that use 2 terabytes of RAM as a service and figure out how to use that effectively, because that's going to be more easily available this year than ever before. So the block on that has always been, it's really hard to get hold of machines with huge amounts of memory. They're very expensive, very hard to find. So they're going to be trivially available from AWS later this year, like by the hour. 2 terabyte plus systems by the hour is going to make it easy to play around with things that are move everything back into one big hunking service.
And we'll just come full circle.
Well, yeah, because there's always use cases for doing that.
Yeah.
And but what you probably do is run a whole bunch of containers on the same machine and use the internal memory bandwidth instead of the network bandwidth, so you don't have latency. And then you have different problems to do with, well, if you lose that, you lose everything in one go if the machine dies. So you have to kind of have at least 2 of them, I guess, or 3 or something.
There's also all kinds of interesting thing going around with hardware and memory that's going to make things so different in the years to come. It's going to be incredible.
Yeah, the persistent memory is another area that's very disruptive that hasn't really happened yet, but it's just starting to bubble up. There's a few techniques for doing that, and I can kind of include that in the Terraservices space. If you get a few terabytes of persistent memory in a system, it behaves quite differently as a storage database tier.
So you said the word disruptive. That's kind of my next question. So what do you feel, I guess, or what do you see from your foxhole? What is the most disruptive tech right now in IT?
I think it's open source in general. The true nature of disruption is when the incumbents just cannot have a play against it, right? If you are making serious money selling on-premise software and you're doing, $1 million deals for these packages that do something interesting in a business, and then somebody comes up with an open source package that roughly does the same thing and somebody has a SaaS version of it or whatever, you can't, just switch. Oh yeah, we have a free version of this. Here, give it to them. Your revenue stream disappears, right? So you end up fighting a losing battle. It's very hard for people to deal with. So you're seeing a lot of the large enterprise vendors, particularly the software vendors, rapidly trying to move to SaaS models, which is what sort of Oracle's doing. You're seeing sort of IBM and HP sort of getting shrinking and finding it harder to sort of justify the kind of deals that they've been doing in the past, and trying to adopt open source but disrupting themselves. I think IBM is very clearly disrupting itself and knows it's doing it and is just taking the pain now because they'll probably be the one that survives. And other big vendors are trying to avoid disrupting themselves and are creating bigger problems downstream. It's actually quite interesting to watch IBM do this. They've done it a number of times before with sort of Java and Linux. So they know what it looks like. It's a really painful process to go through. But of the really big vendors, they're probably the one that's got the sort of best DNA for being able to carry this off. But we're going to lose some of the big vendors somewhere along the way. I mean, we're already they're going take privates and all kinds of strange things going on. And it's really because you can't sell people a huge pile of hardware and software if what they're doing is they're pulling down open source and running it on AWS. There's just no enterprise vendor in the architecture anymore.
Right.
And so they're clinging to the installed bases they've got and trying to figure out how to become relevant.
That's an interesting take on how to view the kind of disruption in the space. I completely agree on open source. I usually I think of it more on a micro level and say containers and unikernels and things along those lines. But you're right, open source and how it's disrupting the large enterprises with Java, and even Microsoft has just completely rewrote their game book over the last few.
Microsoft is very interesting. Yeah, they've gone very heavily into Linux. They're open sourcing stuff. They're porting SQL Server to Linux. Hell has frozen over a bunch of times in the last year or so. Like, they've done what? They got, was it in Bash in Windows 10?
That one caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that one.
Like 10 years ago, I left Sun Microsystems, where of course I was just using Unix as my daily machine for like decades at that point, and then went to eBay, where they gave me a Dell laptop with Windows on it, and I was just like, I couldn't, until I found Cygwin, I put that on it, and then it became just about usable. But it used to drive me crazy. I was happy to get out of that. I was there about 2 or 3 years, and then went to Netflix, where they had enough Mac support that I could get it back to a Mac laptop.
It's nice. It's nice to hear verification from someone with your experience to go through a similar path, because that's pretty much a similar path that I went through from Unix to Cygwin back to a Unix operating system with Mac. So.
Yeah, but I think the problem that Microsoft's got is that there are very few apps right now being ported from Linux to Windows. Right. Well, it's all of the drain is in the opposite direction. So they're trying to prevent the drain off of their core architecture. The Windows they've got a huge install base of Windows and .NET. So they're trying to protect that, and they're trying to catch the things that are moving off of it as they move to Linux as well. Right. So I think they've got the right strategy. It's taking them, and they're probably one of the better positioned sort of enterprise vendors at this point. They've got large SaaS products that are doing reasonably well. My email goes through Office 365, and their leadership the new leadership has really knows what needs to happen. But I still think that it's hard to find people that really know how to use Azure. It's any startup, you find a whole bunch of people know how to use AWS. They just start using it. Maybe there's 1 or 2 people that it's actually just hard to find anybody using Azure or Google. Just because of the dominance of AWS as a known way to get stuff done, right? Whether it's cheaper or better or has whatever features, is actually irrelevant. It's more about they've already captured the market.
AWS has almost become a verb. Even in London, when we did the last QCon, 4 of the 5 architectures you've always wondered about were specifically, we're doing stories talking about EC2 and the things that they're doing with AWS. Or ECS in that particular case.
Yeah, the very first QCon I did was Netflix architectures you've always wondered about. 2010, I think it was 2010, Randy Shoup pulled me in on that one, and I did a little pre-run at a meetup like a month or so before to just shake out the slide deck.
Right.
There was a guy in the audience at that meetup who was the guy that hired me into this VC firm because his wife noticed this meetup and made him go to it. So, so indirectly, I can credit QCon with me getting this job very, very, very indirectly. So that original intro happened sort of randomly through. It's all sort of coincidences and things. But I can definitely recommend anybody that is interested in doing talks, getting out there, trying out your ideas in public. There's no better way to actually test an architecture than put it up and try to explain it to a bunch of people and then see if they pick up ideas from it and you find out what's good and what isn't.
Yeah, in a short period of time. So I don't know if I want to use that quote or not, because Josh Evans just did a Netflix architecture in that same track for London. He did a phenomenal job. He basically talked about it from the Netflix evolutionary. Basically talked about Netflix's architecture as a series of failures. We failed doing this, so we responded in this way. We failed doing this, so we responded in this way, and did just an amazing job.
Yeah, I did the very first Netflix architecture presentation. Then I started getting more invites than I could handle and passed them around internally, and basically sort of got a whole bunch of people into the idea that this worked. And then when I left, they just kept doing it. Now there's 10 or 15 people at Netflix that you can call up that will give a really excellent presentation on some aspect of the architecture. And Josh has got, everyone's got their own view of different pieces of it.
Yeah.
Rosalind Meschenberg, my old partner there, has done some great ones on the highly available architecture. Colton Andres just left Netflix, but he did an excellent talk on failure injection testing. There's a massive amount. I call it technical indigestion, actually. Just trying to keep up with Netflix's technical blog is just a major problem.
Netflix is one of our champions. We absolutely love Netflix and the willingness to be a part. We've got, I think Philip Fisher Ogden is on our committee for New York. We've got Sangeeta. We've got Sangeeta doing the containers track. She's awesome. She spoke in San Francisco at the last QCon. Did a great job. And it's just Netflix is just is a great place and great spirit.
This was the strategy, was to get out there and build a technology brand that created a sort of a strong attractor for developers and ideas and things like that. And it started working, so they kept doing it. It's great to see. And other companies doing it now. You see Matt Ranney from Uber out doing the same kind of things. And that's one of the more crazy architectures now. If you really want to see what the bleeding edge, go see what he's up to. And there's a few ex-Netflix people sort of hanging around at Uber as well. So there's a lot of great stuff out there now to go see about how to build all of these different architectures. Lots of ideas.
So Sudhir Tons is running, I think he's running a failure track, I believe, in New York. And
I think he originally contacted me on this one. Yeah, so he's at Uber. Sudhir's at Uber.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then we were talking open source before with Microsoft. We've got Phil Hack, who was the original PM who shipped MVC.NET and NuGet at Microsoft. He now is a project manager or engineering manager rather at GitHub. So he's running the Microsoft track, and it's called The Amazing Potential of an Open Source.NET. It's all focused on open source.NET and how disruptive it can be.
Is it Snova? Is it Jeremy? Jay Snova? Is it Jeremy or John? The PowerShell guy.
Oh, it's Jeremy.
Jeremy or something.
I don't remember the last name. I just know
his
Jeremy.
thing is how I took the Windows out of Windows, because he basically took the command line driven Windows with just PowerShell and no Windows for server use. And it says they had the fight. It was like a 10-year fight or something to actually get that product done. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna wrap up. So. Thank you, Adrian, for talking with us. And again, if you want to hear more from Adrian, on June 13th through 15th, he'll be at QCon New York, delivering Microservices State of the Union. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you very much. Cheers.